Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. First of all, I would like to thank the Meadows Museum of Art for having invited me to give this talk today in the context of the splendid exhibition which you have probably visited. I would also like to thank them for having carried out this research that has led to the show, Poetics, Dalí Poetics of the Small. This is the first time that the focus is on Salvador Dalí's small format works from his early surrealist period, which had never been systematically studied as a cohering group. I agree with the director Mark Rogland, who says that despite Salvador Dalí's global reputation, there is still much to learn about his artistic development and output. But above all, I would like to thank the museum for carrying out technical studies of 9 of the works on display, undertaken by Claire Berry, Director of Conservation at the Kimbell Art Museum. Technical examination of paintings allow us to explore and to deepen in the artistic and creative processes of the artist and provide us with more insight to the knowledge of the pieces. The Gala-Salvador Dalí Foundation in Figueres has loaned the work Phantom Card from 1933 for the exhibition and provided technical information about the painting, consisting of digital images of the radiography, infrared reflectography, and microphotography of the painting to complement the technical study of the 9 works. The Dalí Foundation is well aware that technical studies of the materials and the pictorial processes are key elements for documenting the collection. Hence, besides its numerous everyday tasks, the Foundation promotes and develops this type of research initiatives. So, when last spring the Meadows Museum invited me to take part in its lecture program on conservation, I was delighted to accept the challenge of presenting our perspective as conservators who transcend the pictorial surface. The Gala-Salvador Dalí Foundation owns significant works belonging to the artist's surrealist period. From the years 1930 to 1936, we have approximately 20 oil paintings, 12 paintings of which are small format works. And 5 of these are painted on wood, as you can see on the screen, along their small measurements. I'm sorry I put in centimeters. Given that they form a coherent group of paintings, since 2011 we have gradually compiled technical information about them. Yet, as in other museums, many of the technical studies carried out at the Foundation's Department of Conservation begin when the works are about to travel on loan to an exhibition. This is when they are unframed, photographed, and examined, especially paintings that are on permanent display in the museum halls. This is the case of the 2 small works I shall present today. Automatic Beginning of a Portrait of Gala, 1933. I put here the inches. It's like 5.5 per 6.3 inches, and Portrait of Gala with 2 lamp chops in equilibrium upon her shoulder from 1934. This is just very small. It's kind of a postcard, which is 2.5 inches by 3.5 inches, this one. Last spring, them both were included in a great exhibition dedicated to the figure of Gala, Dalí's muse, at the National Museum for Catalan Art in Barcelona. The show was a good opportunity to examine the works with X-ray and infrared reflectography in collaboration with the museum laboratories, although there was no time to analyze pigments and other materials. The works were examined using standard non-invasive techniques as stereo microscope, photographed with different light sources, visible and invisible to the naked eye. In these pictures of Gala, for instance, we realize that they provide us with different types of information. Visible light, reflected light that highlights the layer of varnish and the surface texture, the infrared reflectography that reveals underlying preparatory drawings. Again, all these studies provide us with with elements that enable us to identify the technical characteristics of the artwork, the materials and the procedures used by the artist, how he carries out the underlying drawings, how he uses technical resources, how to prepare the wooden supports, and how he applies the layers of paint and color. The results and comparative studies of other similar works help us to understand Dalí's creative process better in a broader sense. We should now point out that the Dalí Foundation, take care of an exceptional heritage full of primary sources material that complement the technical research. Apart from the paintings and drawings collection, we have the rich documentary collection of the Center for Dalínian Studies with Dalí's personal library and archives, and the photography archive. Moreover, Dalí bequeathed his house at Portlligat, a key source of understanding his only permanent atelier and creative hub throughout his career. The specific landscape of this spot, the natural Mediterranean landscape of Cape Cross, Cap de Creus, to which Dalí was so devoted, would condition both the artist's life and the earth. Today, I would like to first contextualize Dalí's works in his atelier in order to better understand his working method. Then, I shall explain the results of our technical study of the two paintings. Salvador Dalí Domènech was born in 1904 in Figueres, in northeastern Catalonia, in Spain. The first 30 years of the 20th century were very fertile for Figueres, a city bordering with France, commercial and cosmopolitan, with a great entrepreneurial activity and an established bourgeoisie. Dalí's father, for instance, was a notary. In 1908, Dalí spent his first summer in Cadaqués, a small coastal village with white houses. Dalí's passion for Cadaqués dates back to that period, and from that time on, his youthful diaries reflect his delight in spending his summer holidays there. The summer of 1929, however, brought a revolution and a change to the artist's life. Gala burst into the Dalínian microcosm, and she had come to stay. Taking a leap in time, we come to 1934, when Dalí, aged 30, painted the two oils. We should bear in mind a number of facts. And please, I will take some water first. When he met Gala in summer of 1929, his life changed its course completely. Despite being 10 years older, a foreigner, and a married woman with a daughter, Gala became his soulmate and his muse, and from then on they stayed together till the end. Dalí had already broken with his family, partly as a consequence of his relationship with Gala. His father expelled him from the family house in Cadaqués, which explains why the couple set out to look for a place to live in. They eventually found in Portlligat a small bay next to Cadaqués, where he began to buy fishermen's hats to start building his future home. Dalí had made a name for himself within the Surrealist group. He had become famous in Paris and would soon be famous in New York too. His exhibitions, publications, and activities proliferated. He worked texts and articles, he painted and drew, created surrealist objects, traveled and delivered lectures, and was generally extremely active. In June 1931, his first solo exhibition was held at the Pierre Cole Gallery in Paris, and this was followed by more and more exhibitions. In November 1934, Dalí and Gala set out on their first journey to the United States to attend the opening of the artist's first solo show at the Julian Levy Gallery in New York. So, in the early 30s, the sojourns of Gala and Dalí around Europe and in the United States became increasingly frequent and comprised long periods of time. These constant journeys, however, didn't prevent them from living between the two worlds that they loved so much, Portligat and Paris. Paris then stood for the capital of the art world. Dalí knew that the key to his success was being accepted in the French city. For this reason, he spent his autumns and winters there, always with a firm intention to gather enough money to invest in his home in Portligat. Given that Dalí lived between Paris and Portligat, the painter had two ateliers. The photographs that have survived and the artist's own comments give us a fair idea of the atmosphere in which Dalí worked and painted his small format works. The atelier is a vital part of Dalí's creative process. It's a place where he could concentrate, secluded from the outside world, where he could heat up his pictorial secrets. So it is not surprising that it should be one of the most important rooms in the houses they occupied, despite being plain and austere usually. I should tell that the Dalí Foundation has published a small but fascinating book about the different ateliers Dalí had during his career. In Paris, Gala and Dalí first lived in the apartment that Paul Leloir and Gala had shared close to Sacré-Cœur. Shortly afterwards, early in July 1932, once Eluard and Gala had obtained a divorce, they moved into a different studio in Montparnasse area at the other end of the capital, where they lived on and off until July 1935. Montparnasse also welcomed other artists, French and foreign, who lived in studio houses around Montsouris Park. In his book, The Secret Life of Salvador Dalí, the artist frequently mentioned the relative economic vulnerability that surrounded the couple during the first half of the 30s. Indeed, some of the details in the photograph provide us with clues. For instance, the use of the functional items of furniture that Dalí considered were more characteristic of the working classes. The poet, writer, and translator David Gascoigne also captured the atmosphere of the atelier in his diaries. During the week he worked as Dalí's translator in his studio, he observed how the artist worked in an apparently calm, focused manner before his easel. With a magnifying glass in one hand and a brush made of free camel hair in the other, as she said, Dalí painted engrossed in his task and practically unaware of the presence of the poet and of everything else. In the photograph, the easel appears in a book-filled room alongside a metal and glass table, Art Nouveau objects, African idols from Gala's personal collection, surrealist objects made by Dalí, and the oil paintings, of course. As mentioned, in 1930, Dalí bought a small deteriorated fisherman's hut in Portligat Bay that forms part of Cape Cross, which he paid for with the money for the painting The Old Age of William Tell. Over these years, the hut would end up becoming Dalí's home and workshop, the primeval core of his personal and professional life, and the only stable atelier he would ever have. To quote Dalí himself, "It was there that I learned to impoverish myself, to limit and file down my thinking in order that it might become effective as an axe, where blood had the taste of blood and honey the taste of honey." The progress of Portligat, as Dalí himself said, the process of the Portligat house resembled the evolution of a biological structure that grew in cellular aggregates, because he made successive extensions and renovations according to his personal and artistic needs. The first hut was in a small space. This was the first hut, and then he bought another one next to him. He put these terraces on the top, but later on, before 1935, he added the two buildings on the top. So the first hut was a small space that measured 22 square meters with no electrical installation. On the ground floor, a versatile space was used as a dining room, a bedroom, studio, and hall, while the upper floor accommodated a bathroom and a kitchen. A short time later, Dalí purchased a second hut that was renovated in 1932, and after a new extension added two further extensions, as I mentioned. We shouldn't forget the importance of the granitic landscape, austere and with its Mediterranean light, surrounding the hut, repeated and reproduced both faithfully and linearly in his paintings. In the Cap of Creus landscape, the artist found the balance and inspiration he needed for his works. Cap Creus was the refuge where the couple hid out during the warmer seasons, fleeing from the decadent Bohemian atmosphere that, according to Dalí, prevailed in the district of Montparnasse. Portligat, where they would go for strolls around the Cap de Creus, enriched him with the fantastic rocky formations that shone like old gold, the views of the bay, the houses and walls, and the silver olive trees. In these familiar surroundings, spaceful and domestic, Dalí kept a disciplined schedule with strict working hours that make a sharp contrast with his active social life, especially in Paris. Dalí was a compulsive worker, and his working capacity was admired by all. From a very early age, he could spend hours and hours working painstakingly on a painting or making notes for an upcoming text. He started work at sunrise and didn't put his palette away until the end of the day. As he himself liked to say, he would only stop to take a bath, have lunch, or take a nap, a siesta. So the works painted between 1932 and 1934-5, including the two paintings of Gala that I'm presenting today, were probably made between the Montparnasse apartment and the first huts in Portligat, bearing in mind that Gala and Dalí lived a nomadic life during the 30s. It comes as no surprise that the size of some of the paintings should be compatible with such lifestyle. In other words, many of the canvases Dalí produced during these years were of a portable size, which could be a good reason, don't you think? Could it be Dalí had therefore adapted the size of his canvases to the needs of the moment, expressing his imaginary in barely a few centimeters? Julian Green, an American writer, in his memoirs wrote that he was surprised by the format of the works he was shown by Dalí. They were all size of a postcard, and yet appeared to be much larger because they had been conceived as great paintings. As he said, He puts the sky and the earth in a space where the hand would not fit, wrote Green about the artist. During these years, the magic of Dalí's paintings is that they were conceptually large, yet they were minute in size. The smallness of these works signals Dalí's precision and skill, and they became small exercises in which the artist put his paranoical critical method into practice. It has often been said that we must seek the origin of Dalí as a miniaturist in his admiration for the painters of the 17th century Flemish school, particularly his fascination with the delicacy and detail of Johannes Vermeer. In his book, 50 Secrets of Magic Craftsmanship, that he wrote later in 1948, Dalí jotted down his appreciations of various artistic aspects of the old masters. In the image, we read inspiration, color, design, geniality, composition, originality, and mystery. Vermeer is undoubtedly the first name on the list, to whom he awards 20 marks in everything except for originality, which is 19, you see. Among Leonardo, Velázquez, Bouguereau, Dalí, Picasso, Raphael, everyone. Furthermore, from 1929 onwards, Dalí's paintings wanted to explore in depth a technique that resembled that of 17th century Dutch masters and which would culminate in 1940. The perfecting of this technique consisted in reproducing reality with a smooth, brilliant pictorial matter that was very delicate and barely revealed the brushstroke, with a detailed precision like that of a photograph. Later on, I shall focus on the details of the pictorial technique. So, we shall now pick up the magnifying glass to enter into the works, into the materials employed by the artist, to see how he applied them. The paintings, as you probably know, have a laminar structure and consist of superimposed layers of paint and other materials. We contemplate them from bottom to top, from the support to the paint and the varnish. We shall begin by pointing out that the two oils were painted on a wooden support instead of on a canvas. This choice can probably be explained by the fact that the smooth, polished qualities of the wood surface brought him closer to the technique developed by the Dutch masters. Now, if we return to the earlier picture of the Parisian art atelier, we discover that the work's automatic beginning of Gala, of Portrait of Gala, and Portrait of Gala with the lobster form a part of an initially much larger plywood panel. You see here, this one is this painting, and Dalí is painting the unfinished Portrait of Gala with lobster here. But the work was soon separated, and what we have now is the oil painted on a plywood panel measuring 1 centimeter in thickness. On the other hand, the oil painting Portrait of Gala with 2 lamb chops, along with the other 3 panels previously mentioned and kept in the foundation, were made of mahogany wood, a dense and compact panel measuring 2 centimeters in thickness. So we see here the plywood panel, and this is a mahogany, very thick board, or very thick wood. And now I show you the radiography where the pictorial composition has all but disappeared in both paintings, leaving visible only the wooden texture. Only a dark stain can be made out in the upper left-hand corner that corresponds to a null loss of painting and grown layers, which is here. And these are two holes in the panel. Okay. Dalí prepared all the wooden supports of these works with thin layers of ground, a smooth and polished texture presumably made in a traditional style. It's important to stress that the bright white color used in this ground produces a visual impact on the spectator through the colors. And the white primer can also be discerned under magnification among the colors of the finished work. This is a Dalí's choice for his artistic intentions and a pictorial strategy. In these works, on top of this prepared support, Dalí painted Gala, his muse and model. At the onset of his career, Dalí used to paint his sister, but as soon as he met Gala, she became his model par excellence. So Gala became one of the key elements in Dalí's creative process. Besides being a source of inspiration and a model in some of his most outstanding works, we always find her supporting the artist managing his daily affairs. Gala even took responsibility for providing Dalí with his art materials and painting utensils, and read it loud to him during his long painting sessions. His recognition of Gala was wholehearted and sincere, and from 1931 onwards, he would often write Gala's name beside his own when signing a word. He put Gala, Olivette, for the oval shape of her face and the color of her skin that evoke olives. The exhibition includes a few examples of these signatures, although the two paintings of Gala I'm presenting today are unsigned, probably because they were kept by Dalí for himself. Besides these two small works, we can find other paintings, some on display, where Gala has been portrayed, such these ones on the screen. Gala and the Angelus of Millet preceding the imminent arrival of the conical metamorphosis, portrait of Gala and portrait geodesic of Gala. In all these paintings, we see that Gala's image derives from a photograph. This is the period that the early 30s, when Dalí began to use photography as a pictorial resource in his working practice, a practice that he would continue to pursue throughout his career. We see, well, it's easy to see. This portrait of Gala, for instance, from 1931, is a collage made from a tiny photograph of Gala in which her hair has been retouched with paint. Dalí had already used collage in other earlier works. The lions in the accommodations of desire, for example, in the exhibition. But in most cases, he would transfer the image of Gala from the photograph to the surface of the painting. So Dalí turns to photography both in material terms, as a technical strategy used in the making of his paintings, and in a conceptual term, given that these small pictures, according to Dalí's text of 1935, are but instantaneous and hand-done color photography of the superfine, extravagant images of concrete irrationality. Excuse me. But how does Dalí render Gala's photograph on top of the prime board? We have evidence that throughout his career, Dalí carried out much preliminary works on his paintings, making sketches and notes of the various elements and compositional drawings, emphasizing the importance of drawing as part of the preparation for the painting. We also come across numerous drawings related to the compositional theme and images that he will reuse in other works. Such is the case of the drawings and prints made for his illustrations to the 1934 book Les Champs de Maldoror, on which he was working during the same period, and where we also find Gala's face. This is here. There is also this study for Gala's painting, this one, made of Indian ink on wooden panel from the Art Institute of Chicago. And the foundation has this wonderful drawing, this one, with the face of Gala, the other painting. To come back to the image of Gala with the olive tree's branches, we see that it is an unfinished work, only painted in the central area and therefore revealing the layer of white ground on the rest of the surface. We can see a part of a preparatory drawing made with charcoal-based material in the area of the ear and the neck, not yet covered in paint or with paint, which is this one. But when we examine the digital reflectograph, we discover the rest of the splendid preliminary drawing beneath the layer of paint. The underlying drawing is painstakingly made, and we can see the outlines of the figure. The IRR of the Gala with the two lamp shops painting reveals the same kind of painstaking work under the paint layers. We can also make out the shape of the nose outlined with dots or small strokes, and the lines and strokes that indicate the areas of the shadow that will create the volume effect in the cheek and by the lip. Well, now we will see better in this one. We see the dots here, which creates the volume of the nose and the shadows for the cheek and the rest of the face. If we take a closer look, we can also see the underlying drawing thanks to the transparency of the pink layer of the paint, specifically in the areas of the lips and the nose. Under magnification, the charcoal lines are clearly visible among the colors of the paint layer, where they do not cover the outlines, such as the areas around the eyes and lips. Well, here we can see a little bit the lines, the underlying lines, and also the dots here in the nose. And then here we can see the ground, the white ground, which is visible among the colors. And this is the photomicrograph, where we can see also the charcoal lines and the ground, white ground under the paint layer. The realism of the eyelashes, depicted by one, shows that the color has been applied following the exact indications of the underdrawing. No formal differences can be perceived between the underlying drawing, made with charcoal-based drawing, as I told you, and the final execution of the work. At this point, we can confirm that the faces of Gala were traced from a photograph transferred to the surface of the wooden panel. And this would be the photograph from which he chose Gala, a beautiful image of the couple in Port Lligat we saw earlier. But how Dalí prepare the other elements of the pictorial composition for Gala with the two lamp chops? Did he make a direct drawing of his everyday landscape that was surrounding him, or did he trace it from a photograph? The IRR images reveal a direct underlying drawing of some parts of the background, such as the area around the window, the door, made with the help of a roller, and the shadows of the wall. Like this, here, this would be the shadows of the wall. This is not very good image, but anyway, we can see something. If we focus on the area in the front of the door, we can make out lines resembling those of the piece of the cloth more on the right. So we wonder whether this was a correction made to the positioning of the cloth that was discarded in the final stage of the painting. Here we can see these lines that resemble the lines of this area of the cloth, this cloth. The infrared image of the half-demolished well or circular construction also shows the underlying drawing in detail, particularly the vertical lines of the shadow of the inside. In some parts of the well, the lines of drawing seem to have been made twice or emphasized, perhaps as a result of the actual observational freehand drawing or a slight correction of the position. And the same could be said for the lines defining the figure of the child and his hat. We see these lines of the shadow here, for example. So the flawless underlying drawing of Gala's face, traced without any corrections, forms a sharp contrast with other nearby elements such as the door, the wall, the cloth, the well, or the child, drawn directly with barely a few insignificant changes. You can see the old pictures of the door and walls of the fisherman huts close to the Dalí's home, and of the well with the portrait of Dalí seated inside. These were his immediate surroundings, so he had probably drawn sketches from them. And these are the buildings today, that they are still standing. And these are present-day photographs. Oops, sorry. And we see this well, which is now white. Now that we have the board ready with the preparatory drawing, let's discuss the pen layers. Dalí followed the same pictorial process in both panels of Gala, painting first the main character, Gala's face, and then the other elements in the compositions. In Gala with the olive tree branches, it is plain to see because he only painted Gala's portrait and part of the olive trees in an unfinished surreal composition with no other constructions nearby. In both works, the oil paint has been applied with care, painstakingly, with absolute realism. The pictorial work adhered closely to the planned underlying drawing, with precision over the lines and filling in the shapes, as mentioned previously. The examination with stereomicroscope reveals that the paint layers are very subtle, delicate, and fluid, in some points even revealing some of the underlying drawing and the brilliant white primer. Again, we see the underlying here in the nose, and, well, I can see so. And here we can see the white ground, which makes as a light dot in the face. After applying the base colors, Dalí painted wet on wet in semi-transparent brush strokes, almost like glazes that do not completely blend with those beneath and yet provide great chromatic richness. In other areas, Dalí resorted to a minute touches, colored punctilious dots that were superimposed to create an effect of volume, as we see in Gala's cheek. These little dots, which are different colors dots, and creates the final color. In the hair And in the background, Dalí used very delicate paintbrushes for the hair and the olive branches, followed by teeny touches of white on the leaves, as we see in the microphotograph, and which gave a little texture with raking light. Here, the chromatic palette is rich within the same color range, where shades of green, blue, pinks, and ochres prevail, in keeping with the olive green Dalí used for Gala's face. Thanks to the stereo microscope examination, we learned that to paint the fisherman's hat in the background, Dalí applied a delicate and fluid layer of paint, following the underlying drawing again, ochre gray for the walls and ground, blue for the door frame. Then he applied a very liquid paint directly to the surface, using a fine paintbrush to create the profiles and irregular reliefs of the walls. In other areas, as the central area of the wall or the ground, Dalí creates volumes and light by means of short, crisscrossed or puntillised brush strokes in vibrant colors with tiny texture. The palette is typical of Dalí at that time and includes yellow, orange, pink, ochres, greens, and blues. The brightness of the palette and the Mediterranean light are also achieved by using the impressionist puntillism of clear, final touches that make the colors vibrate and provide nuances and depth. In technical terms, Dalí was a highly skilled painter, as proved by the fact that in such small paintings, which is, I said, 2.5 by 3.5 inches, which leaves little space for mistakes, he made no correction whatsoever. Dalí knew very well what he was going to do, and he did it very confidently, applying the paintbrush to just the right spots. In this painting, the child and a repeated figure in Dalí's works of the period, and the chops represent his contribution to the unconscious world. Dalí explained that when he and Gala arrived in New York for the first time in November 1934, journalists asked him why he had painted two chops beside his wife. He replied, "I told them that it was because I liked my wife and that I liked chops, and that I saw no reason why I should not paint them together." To conclude, the technical study carried out has enabled us to explore these works in depth and note the extraordinary similarities between the two as regards the materials employed, the way of transferring the images or not onto the surface, and the pictorial construction. We understand that what Dalí did with these two small-scale pictures was characteristic of his pictorial production of the 30s. Both paintings fell in perfectly with Dalí's surrealist masterpieces, although we need to do more research. Finally, I would like to stress the significance Dalí attached to the two oils of Gala. The artist always kept them in his own private collection. When the Dalí Museum opened in Figueres in 1974, they were displayed, as Dalí asked for, in one of the most important rooms, the Old Masters' Rooms, where they were hung between works by other artists he admired, such as Duchamp, Fortuny, Meissonier, and Bouguereau. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. And I want to thank Mark Roglan and Shelley and all my colleagues here at the Meadows for providing us the opportunity to do this technical study on the small format surrealist paintings by Dalí. I need to also acknowledge the work of my colleague, Peter van der Mortel, who co-authored the essay with me and who also participated in the formation of this talk today. I think I have too many slides, so I hope I don't go over my time. It was just hard to winnow down the number of paintings I would talk about today. This will be a very informal presentation. What I primarily want to do today is talk about the way Dalí is handling the paint in these paintings. So I will touch a little bit upon underdrawing and things that we detected during our examination, but it's really more as a means to talk about the paint. And I also want to acknowledge the work of Irene. Thank you for collaborating with us and sharing your technical images of your painting with us, which is very helpful. So let's get started. The Dalí examination in the studio actually began before the Zubran project has actually ended. One of the pleasures of working in a conservation studio in a museum is that sometimes you get these interesting neighbors. So having these Zubran patriarchs overlooking Mark as he's examining myself at age 10 when I was a grasshopper child is very interesting and very fitting, perhaps because Zubran was one of the artists that Dalí really admired at the Prado. But also just to show you that the vast difference in scale. So we went from examining these slightly larger than life-size paintings of the patriarchs to these minute paintings on canvas and panel. And coming from a study like Zubran, where so much of what we learned from examining those paintings was the system, the repetitive system that the workshop used in creating these masterpieces, whereas with Dalí, what we uncovered was a lot of diversity, and that was very interesting, diversity of technique. These were the paintings that we had the opportunity to examine in the studio, 9 works in all, and I also need to acknowledge the collaboration of the Dalí Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, which loaned us these paintings. They were equally divided between canvas and panel, which was interesting. And if this were a class and we had more time, I'd ask you to try to guess which are on panel and which are on canvas, but we'll be seeing details very shortly. The 10th painting was The Accommodations of Desire, which we actually examined at the Metropolitan Museum. It was not able to travel to the studio. Just very briefly, Dalí did have some important teachers when he was growing up. He was very conversant with Impressionist painting and color. He copied, Cubist-style paintings. He had formal education at the Special School of Drawing, painting, painting, sculpture, and engraving, I think, right? And also, he attended the Academy de San Fernando in Madrid. So he had a very good formal education. And he was very visually literate in terms of, as a young boy, he was even studying old master paintings already from reproductions, small reproductions. And so he grew up thinking about art, and once he got to Madrid, he really absorbed the collection of the Prado. You see him quoting the work of other artists. As we know from the exhibition, he especially admired Vermeer, but also Meissonier, and a number of other artists. So this is the painting that we examined from the Metropolitan Museum, The Accommodations of Desire, which is actually a dialogue between collage and painting. It's painted on panel, and one of the things that I find interesting about it is that rather than respecting this very smooth surface of the panel, he uses this brown underpaint and textures it, with his brush. So he's already creating kind of a rough surface to work against. This is something I find fascinating about these small format pictures, when he's really after a very smooth surface and when he's not. And he he varies between those two ideas. You can see that he's using cutouts from a printed child's book, this Head of the Lion, which is then pasted directly to the white rocks. And he used that cutout as to trace the form on other rocks, such as the one just above it, where he paints the silhouette of the lion in red paint, very carefully outlining, following the outlines of the paper cutout. And you can see how he's texturing the white paint of the rock, similar to the way he's texturing the brown background. He's also working with this idea of negative space, cutting out the face of the lion. You'll see this idea repeated over and over again in his work in different ways. And to the lower right, he is painting these minuscule ants, which we're going to get a closer look at in just a moment. Another example of him using collage here, just cutting out the mouth and painting it on the white background of the lion's head. Again, you can see how he's using, broad brush strokes to lay in the white paint. He's applying the paint wet and wet with a lot of energy. When you look at the edge of the outline, you can see that he's using underdrawing to very carefully outline the jagged mane of the lion, and how with a tiny brush, he's going and filling in very carefully, respecting those outlines, with the red paint. Let's see if I can get like that. We think that possibly there's a piece of paper missing here. When you look at the middle of that red form of the lion's head, it looks as though something may have fallen off, and that would have been consistent with what he was doing in other parts of the painting. We don't really know for sure. But looking at the edge of that mane, you can see here he's using incised lines. He's incising directly into the white paint to establish the jagged outlines of the mane. In this case, he's not being maybe quite as careful. You can see him not fully respecting the outlines and even covering one of the outlines with paint here. But, and another one of the rocks where I find it so interesting, where that sunflower almost seems to take on the form of this lion's mane as well. And of course, again, he's painting the lion here, but following, using the printed image of the lion as a guide. And I love this little photo micrograph that shows the care with which he's applying the impasto both to the edge of the rock and also to these shells and the snails. And how he uses this printed head of the lion as inspiration for how he would paint the lion. So really emphasizing the golden brown color and especially the importance of the black lines, really exaggerating them. The black paint is almost in relief. It almost reminds you of the way the printed lion appears, where the black lines are slightly in relief as an artifact of the printing method. And we see that in the way it's painted as well. I'm going to apologize in advance. You're going to be seeing some of these purple reflections because I took a lot of these images in the galleries with my iPad, and sometimes you get those reflections. So it's not in the painting. And using that same method of painting for the figures that we saw in his painted lion, where the black shadows, the black lines are really exaggerated. And they're painted very broadly and boldly. Again, he's not really using the panel support as an opportunity for very fine, minute painting overall in this work, except when you look at the way he paints the ants, where it looks like those legs and arms are almost painted with a single hair of a brush. And again, how he uses that underlying white paint to suggest the highlights, to suggest the roundness of the back of the insect. This is something that we'll see again and again in his work, the way he uses sometimes the ground, in this case it's paint, but that underlying layer. The Fishman is just a wonderful work of art, and doing this study has given us many more insights into this painting. I find it fascinating that it's on canvas, and he does very little to hide the texture of the canvas weave in the final surface. Here there was very interesting underdrawing in graphite. I think Dalí has made some contradictory statements over the years about the importance or the role of drawing in painting, sometimes saying it's the honesty of painting, other times saying, to be a good painter, you really don't know how to learn how to draw. You just need a straight edge. You can trace. And other times he praises drawing. So he varies in what he says. But we found he used preliminary graphic outlines to lay out the composition, but he made a lot of changes. And what you see highlighted in red on the right are the things that he eliminated from the final composition. So there are other underdrawing lines that we didn't highlight, where he establishes, the perspective of this plinth, for example. But he really made a lot of interesting changes here, moved the position of the cypress tree, eliminated two figures from the background, moved the shoe, etc. We found a lot of variation in his use of drawing. I was very fascinated to see the very meticulous underdrawing that you found under the two portraits of Gala, where they were based on photographs, because we didn't find anything like that, but we did find a lot of variation. And in this painting, you can see again, he's allowing the underlying tonality of the ground to show through in the final surface of the plinth. There on the left, where we can also glimpse at the underdrawing, which he hasn't really attempted to conceal. And on the right, we can see where he left a little sliver in exposed to expose the white ground around the clock, the edge of the clock, where we can also see some of the graphite underdrawing in that area. I think it's interesting the way he applied these little dabs of color, these little tiles of color, so boldly in not a very meticulous way. This was a very this provided an opportunity for us to sample some of his colors with the assistance of John Twilley, a conservation scientist we often work with. And what we basically learned was that even though there were a lot of new pigments coming on the market during these years when Dalí was painting these small-scale works, he primarily used an Impressionist palette. Later, in 1948, he writes a book, The 50 Secrets of Magical Craftsmanship, and that was something that we consulted quite often to see how did the materials and techniques that we uncovered in these paintings line up with what he recommended later, and we found some interesting contradictions between what he was practicing in these years and then what he wrote about and recommended later. I thought it was interesting, too, to compare the way he's dealing with these two plinths. The one on the left, he's clearly using a straight edge and Red Lake to very meticulously outline those bricks, and then contrast it with the more impasto application of the mosaic tiles on the right. I think these images also give you a sense of the surface in which, the canvas weave is a very prominent feature. It's not a very thickly painted painting. So that's something he plays with constantly, we found throughout these works. Also, you notice the shoe that he adds to the chest of L'Homme Poisson, mirroring the shoe that's positioned in the upper left of the painting there. One of the things he writes about later in 50 Secrets is the use of blue, and he recommends both cerulean blue and ultramarine blue. He especially recommends cerulean blue for the sky, and that's what we found him doing here. He paints the sky with cerulean blue, but then he uses synthetic ultramarine blue to outline the cypress tree. And it's a very, very subtle distinct, way of outlining that tree and giving it a little bit of shadow and separation from the sky. When you look at the painting in normal light, I don't think you would really notice that. So this was one of the fun surprises that we encountered. And similarly, I think he showed a lot of care in the way he outlines that red shoe, the heel of that red shoe, using a red lake, a red violet lake. We found that he used a number of different shades of red lake, so this was a pigment that was very important to him in his work. And then I just, again, wanted to show how the shoe repeats itself in the chest of the L'Homme Poisson. And the head of the figure, of course, is comprised of all of these different fish, and possibly with some eel cascading from the head, perhaps representing the hair. And, you know, I threw in this quote because he is looking at other artists, I think, very often. In this case, one artist who comes to mind is de Chirico, and who created this painting in 1914, and surely Dalí must have known it. The sense of perspective and recession into space, the sense of a contrast between light and shadow, the very strong raking shadows. But also, obviously, he's looking at an artist like Arcimboldo, who created these heads out of flowers and vegetables. And it's an idea that Dalí picks up on over and again, and that even Magritte in later years picks up on, another surrealist painter. And as we just heard from Irene, that sometimes Dalí would sign these paintings for Olivet, which you see here. I'm showing it with this tiny depiction of the pebble on the left. It's so interesting to me when he decides to go very small like that. So just adding that little pebble, which is almost the same size as the crown of one of these canvas threads. You know, it's so tiny, and it almost competes with the weave of the canvas. And then just this minute signature, which you really need magnification to read clearly. This beautiful painting from Yale, we didn't have the chance to examine in the studio, but it was really interesting for Peter and me to see it in the gallery upstairs. You can see how he's now painting on board, and I think using that smooth surface to really play off of, painting really thinly with really dilute paint in this case, but then in certain select areas adding impasto very deliberately. He's also playing with the idea of the plinth again, as we just saw. He is using some underdrawing to establish the lines, the perspective in the plinth and in the floor. I don't know if you can see it, but he originally sketched the little diamond shape above the head here on the plinth, and then he moved it to the upper background. But you can see how thinly he's painting and applying these very thin applications of parallel brushstrokes that allow the light tonality of the ground to show through. But then, for example, in the diamond, using the white impasto to concentrate the light on that shape. And in the background, he's adding a very interesting texture to add a sense of kind of sparkling light to the sky, and how he's almost drawing with paint to create that tiny figure in the upper right, using the white impasto to articulate the form. And again, painting this ant, it's almost like a visual pun, the way the shape of the ant here mimics part of the key. And, you know, the contrast between these really opaque details here and the very thin applications of paint elsewhere creates a really interesting dynamic. And I love this rainbow of colors. It almost looks as though it was applied with watercolor. So this is another theme that we picked up on throughout our study, how he plays with transparency and opacity within the same work. This is an interesting work from the Wadsworth Athenaeum, in that the palette is so restricted. It almost reminds me of one of Picasso's Blue Period paintings. And you know he's thinking very carefully, when am I going to use ultramarine? When am I going to use cerulean blue? But then he contrasts it with these kind of golden rocks and creates a really nice contrast between the warm and the cool tonality of the pigments, almost a technique that the Impressionists would use. And I wanted to point out again how thinly it's painted. That figure evaporates at the bottom, almost in a ghostly way. And again, how pronounced the canvas weave is on the surface. That's a deliberate choice he's making. And I also wanted to point out how how skillful he is at drawing with the brush. So to do the jagged rocks, you know, he initially just outlines them with the brush and then comes back in and reinforces those outlines with more black paint to create those shadows. And I thought these two paintings, they relate so closely together, one with a lower horizon and one with a much higher horizon, but he's really doing so much the same thing, and they're almost exactly the same size. But here, adding the ghostly shape, working with a very neutral palette, but just having the golden rocks as an accent. And again, the way he's painting those rocks, he's drawing with the brush, outlining, and then coming back with the paint, really quite thinly painted. But he gets so much realism and depth in those rocks. I found this to be one of the most fascinating paintings in the exhibition from the point of technique, and I wish I could have the chance to examine it in the studio. The Single of Anguish from the National Galleries of Scotland, oil on wood. And in this case, he really is using the smooth surface of the panel very deliberately. It says here that it's oil on wood, and I wonder if they've ever analyzed the technique, because the medium, because to me, it looks like it's painted in an aqueous medium, tempera. It almost looks like a fresco. I think that was very deliberate on his part. He's clearly thinking about Italian painting. Made me think about Botticelli. It's not an exact, it's not the perfect comparison, but the emphasis on the hair and the very voluptuous form of the nude. Also the very decorative way that Botticelli is adding those leaves in the background. And I love the way Dalí has added these branches and uses the silhouettes of the leaves, contrasts those with the figure. But look at the strands of hair. I mean, to me, he's using a very quick drying medium to get that kind of precision. And again, it shows how skillful he is at that kind of minute detail when he decides that that's what he's after. And I thought that it was fascinating to look at the drapery and the leggings on the figure, and you see the way the shadows in the drapery, they're not blended, wet and wet, like you see in oil paint. They're more like very careful, linear hatch strokes. And it reminded me of an Italian Renaissance painting, the way the drapery was modeled in our little Fra Angelico at the Kimbell. And especially if you see the leggings, I think. And his use of color is so beautiful and subtle in this painting. I thought it was also interesting the way he uses the green paint for parts of the figure, especially the chest and the back, and it made me think of the green underpaint that you see in flesh tones in Italian painting for Vermeer, and it made me wonder, is he thinking about that too? And I think you can see that in the flesh tones of the Duccio at the Kimbell. And again, just a detail of those beautiful strands of hair, and look at the precision with which he can paint that shirt or that cloth hanging from the window, and the very subtle variations of color, the lavenders, the blues, the yellows that he's using in that window. Also think that this is a painting that may have been vandalized, or did Dalí do that himself? But it looks like somebody had scratched an X into her head. I don't know, but they did a good job, because you have to magnify the painting pretty highly to see that. But again, he's created a very dry, parched surface that really reminds me of a fresco surface, almost more than a tempera painting. And I think that was very deliberate. And even if you look at the shadows here, we're so used to seeing those really dark, almost black shadows in Dalí, and look at how he's using a lavender shadow here. Much more subtle kind of pastel range of color. This painting, again, which we only could examine in the exhibition, but is fascinating. One of the things that fascinated me is his use of perspective here from as Scott pointed out, this is not a door, it's actually a canvas. From the canvas and the angle coming down to the figure of Gala, which is painted from a photograph, as we just saw in Irene's presentation. It again reminded me of that kind of very sharp recession that you see in De Chirico. Also, the tonality of the gold color reminded me of that. But also, as Scott pointed out, he could have had Velázquez in mind by positioning that huge canvas in the foreground the way he did in Las Meninas. Again, he's playing with the idea that we see in Arcimboldo, that we saw in the Fishman, of creating a human head with other forms, a lobster, shells, shaft of wheat. So inventive. Again, he's borrowing an idea, but he's doing it, executing it exactly in his own way. I mean, you wouldn't mistake that head for any other artist, I don't think, but Dalí. And quoting one of his favorite paintings, of course, the Angelus of Millet in the background. I thought it was interesting when it came to looking at the way he's handling paint in the figure of of Gala, that I think he's really looking very closely at the photograph. So, for example, in the photograph where you have these little white dots here and the highlights on her cheek, he's very careful to replicate, I think, in the painting, the shadows and so on. And just, I think it's interesting the way the technique in some ways follows the appearance of the photograph. Phantom Card is one of my favorite paintings. Thank you for, again, sharing your technical information on it and for allowing it to be in this exhibition. I think you can see, again, just from the few examples that we've looked at, how flexible Dalí is in his use of color, sometimes using a really restricted palette like this, and other times, like the painting that we just saw, using this kaleidoscope of colors. But even in a painting like this, which appears to be very muted, we'll see that he's really bringing in a lot of different colors, but just in a more subtle way. Of course, you know, this is a visual pun where the figure in the card is actually represented by the shape of a building. So he's approaching, it's one of these visual puns that Dalí is so good at. And here I would say he's really respecting the smooth surface of the panel and seeing what that allows him to do with impasto. And it's one of these thicker panels. Not all of the panels that we examined were identical. Many of them were thick like this one, but for example, the Italian influence painting that I just showed you was on a very thin panel. So there was some variation, and this would be a very good area to do further research in. There's so many, what this study has taught us is there's so much more that can be done in studying Dalí. There's so many ideas for further research. So, and I just wanted to make this comparison to show how this kind of perspective, this recession, is something that he comes back to over and over again in his paintings, but does such different things with it. They end up looking so different. But they're really starting with the same idea of these perspectival lines going back into space, as they do in Phantom Card. And I'm making a funny comparison here to The Lace Maker by Vermeer, because when we really look closely at the way he's applying these little pebbles and these little highlights in the foreground and in the buildings, it made me think about those little highlights that you see in paintings by Vermeer. I don't know that he was thinking that specifically, but I feel like he's replicating that technique here with these little highlights. And again, if you look at his use of color, it's amazing. There's much more variation than you might think at first. The way he's adding reds to the buildings, and these little blue accents in the foreground. It's just gorgeous. I also wanted to make the point, the color red, vermilion, was very important to Dalí. We know that from his writings. And he says it's a color that you need to be very strategic with, like Velázquez. And so it's only, I think, when you really look at this painting up close, you realize how he's using red in that cart. Adding these very select highlights, very deliberately. The Weaning of Furniture Nutrition, 1934, is a fascinating painting. Again, it's on panel, and in this case, he had a preparatory drawing for the figure of the woman, for the nurse, which he traced. And it was fascinating to be able to examine the underdrawing in this work. Also, he's really using the tonality of the white ground very deliberately in parts of the composition, exposing it, for example, along the edges of the boats, and we'll see a detail. This is actually exposed white ground here. And if you look at the sky and the way the paint is blended, he was using like badger brushes, fan-shaped badger brushes, to very carefully blend that paint to create such a different effect of those kind of diaphanous clouds, which is so different from the way he's treating the foreground, where the forms are much more solidly modeled. And I find that variation that he gets within a single work fascinating. Here's the detail where you can see, I hope, that he's just leaving a thin reveal of the white ground to create the sharp contours of these boats, which may have been traced from a photograph. But look again at the way he's painting, the gravel with these little pinpoint touches of paint and highlights. And same as in the background, these little white highlights that he adds, just minute. Here's the drawing that he traced, and so you get the mirror image of it in the painting. So we have very rigid outlines for the figure here. In the underdrawing that he respected, we really didn't see a lot of pentimenti in the painted surface of these works, as Irene pointed out. The pentimenti that we see are sometimes in the underdrawing, like in Fishman, but not in the final paintings. And here I just added this quickly. It doesn't show so well in this particular photograph, but when you look at the painting in the galleries, you can see how he's using a stylus to incise all of these perspectival lines. So just to show you another example of how he's using underdrawing and contour lines in his creative process. So we see him using incisions, we see him tracing, we see him doing freehand sketching. We see all these different techniques. This is one of my favorite paintings in terms of talking about texture, The Ghost of Vermeer of Delft, which I think you can best appreciate by looking through the microscope. I'm showing you two photomicrographs there on the right. The one on top is from this part of the wall, and this is from part of the foreground. And you can see how he's painting wet and wet, really mixing colors together, the lavender, the orange in the foreground, the green, the orange on the wall itself. But when I look at this texture, it seems so unique to Dalí. No other artist comes to mind who could create this texture, which I don't know how to describe it other than sometimes I think of it as little shards of glass because it comes up in little points. And this was one of the most enjoyable things about looking at these paintings, was looking at this kind of varied texture. I always think that when you put a painting under the microscope, it's an acid test of how good the artist is, how good a painter they are. And I've always noticed if they're interesting and if their work is beautiful under the microscope, it's a great artist. It's as simple as that. And I've really gained a lot of respect for Dalí as a painter as a result of doing this study, and I'd really love to study more works. The Man with the Head of Blue Hortensias from 1936 is on canvas, and you can see how dilute so much of the paint is, especially when you look in the mountains. It almost reminds you of watercolor. He's really thinning down his oil paint with a lot of turpentine, and the painting, I think, in many ways is a dialogue between opacity and transparency. And the photomicrographs are fascinating. Again, the head of the man himself. When you see his use of color, adding the red, the different shades of blue, painting wet and wet, those opaque highlights play off the other transparent areas of the head, and the landscape. So much of it is very transparent. But then when you look in certain details, you see how he's adding the impasto wet and wet and creating these really interesting textures and highlights. And again, not denying the surface, the canvas weave of the canvas weave in the final image. In fact, almost accentuating it by applying this very dilute paint where it settles into the interstices of the canvas weave there on the right and just plays that up. And on the left, I was really surprised to see just over the crest of that hill that he painted these two minute birds flying in the sky. I mean, I don't know how you would see them at a normal viewing distance, but when you look under the microscope, they were there. Geological justice is really, I think, one of the gems of this exhibition, and I got to see it here for the first time. And in that it's also dated 1936 and it's in the last gallery, I felt like this would be a nice painting to end with. It's as if he's taken a lot of the ideas that we've seen him working with in earlier paintings and distilling them into this image. I find it so beautiful and so sophisticated. At first, it looks rather neutral, but on second glance, you see how subtly he's using different shades of blue, the cooler blue in the water, the cerulean blue in the sky. He's, really blending the clouds with his badger hair brushes to create these very soft, diffuse outlines, this diaphanous sky, using these tiny dots of paint to create the texture in the foreground or the mountains. The very select use of texture here on the beach. And in the water, just ever so subtly, how he uses the bristles of his brush, to create the sense of the movement of the water there. And again, if you contrast it with the sky. And this texture here on the beach that reminds me of those little shards of glass-like texture that we saw in the Ghost of Vermeer painting. The other thing I like about this painting, and I've done it here, is you can divide it into like 3 paintings. You can break it into 3 details, and I think any one of them would stand on their own as a nice painting. And this is something I've noticed about Dalí too. The overall composition works really well, but you can break it into parts and they still work. So that's what I've done. I've broken it into these 3 parts, and I'll end with this one. Again, you can see the subtle use of blue, the lavender, all the variation. It's just a beautiful, serene image, and I think he's really come into his own in this painting. Thank you very much for your attention.